On behalf of the Hi everyone. On behalf of the Collective Impact Forum, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Communities Defining Quality Collective Impact. Thank you for joining us. It is the first of a three-part series diving deeper into the content of articles in the Collective Insights on Collective Impact supplement in the fall 2014 Stanford Social Innovation Review. My name is Paul Schmitz, and I'm a Senior Advisor to the Collective Impact Forum, a partnership between FSG and the Aspen Forum for Community Solution. I just recently joined, and it's been great working with this group. We have a terrific program for you today with a tremendous group of speakers, but before we get started, I want to touch on a few items. Today's program is 60 minutes long, and you are encouraged to submit written questions and comments at any time during the presentation. Click on the General Chat tab at the bottom of your screen. Type your question in the box at the bottom of that space, and then click Send. Your questions are only visible to the presenters, and the presenters will verbally respond to as many questions as time allows during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be redirected to an online evaluation form. Please take a moment and complete the evaluation. We value our feedback, and it'll especially help us as we prepare for the next two parts of the series. If you need any technical assistance during the webinar, please call KRM support at 1-800-775-7654. Today's slides will be available following the presentation at collectiveimpactforum.org. And if you haven't registered an account yet, please make sure to do so. It's a great forum and resource for all of us doing this work. And finally, during today's presentation, your slides will be automatically synchronized with the audio. You do not need to flip your slides to follow along. With that introductory, I'd like to now introduce Ben Hecht, the President and CEO of Living Cities, who will be moderating today. Ben?
Great. Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. We go back a number of years now with StriveTogether when they started out as an individual program in Cincinnati, and we're really developing this framework of the theory of action. So we're really excited to be a long-term partner and to see the interest across the country of folks who've come together to really make a difference on a really important national issue. Today we're going to talk about the challenge of improving the educational system and outcomes for kids, with the idea of collective impact being an important answer to seemingly impossible, vexing problems. And importantly, we're going to hear stories from work on the ground of people who've been actually putting this theory into action. As Paul said, this is part of a series that's called Collective Insights on Collective Impact, and it comes from an article that Jeff Edmondson, who's on today's webinar, and I wrote about trying to really bring defining quality and collective impact and trying to ensure that there's a rigor brought to it. We're excited about the progress that StriveTogether and many of the cities like those on the phone have been able to make, the progress they've been able to make, not only because it's based on really what's working in communities, but also because it's really relying on data and the focus on continuous improvement to really build upon successes and actually stop doing what doesn't work and focus on what does. And interestingly, over the years, we've been working with StriveTogether in this cradle-to-career area. We've also been transferring these same principles and the same type of framework to other areas beyond education and youth. We really think it's one of the most important approaches to solving our nation's really challenging problems. So let me introduce the panelists who we have here today, and like Paul said, it's a pretty extraordinary list of folks. We have Jim Shelton, Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education. We have Jeff Edmondson, the Managing Director of StriveTogether, which is a subsidiary of KnowledgeWorks. Todd Williams, Executive Director of the Commit Partnership. And we have Dan Ryan, the CEO of All Hands Raised. You'll hear from both of them, and both of them are putting these ideas into action on the ground, and we're really glad that they've joined us. Please join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #CollectiveImpact. Jim, let me move to you if we can. At a time when federal dollars and education investment is so stretched, what are some ways you are working to help make sure that we're able to think and work differently to improve educational outcomes for kids?
So I think that what we've seen is that we've tried to create, since the beginning of the administration, a real urgency around the importance of education, not only to the individuals that it impacts and their communities and their families, but also to the overall economic imperative that we face as a nation. What we're seeing is that, even in these difficult times where we think that where we've seen the economy expand, we're not seeing employment rebound the way we'd like to see it. And a lot of that is tied to the gap between the skills that our young people, and frankly, the vast majority of Americans have, and the skills in the marketplace that are being required in the marketplace. What we also know, though, is that there's many aspects to actually fixing the educational challenge. We've done a lot of work specifically focused on improving the core of the education system, the standards, the data that we use, the effectiveness of our teachers, the way we deal with our worst performing schools. But we recognize that there are other things that get in the way of children being ready to learn, young people being able to access opportunity, afford college, and find employment. And that by bringing these resources and assets together, we can dramatically improve the effectiveness and impact of each one of them. And that's why this work has become so important, is because it recognizes the integrated nature of these challenges and how we need to work together to solve these problems.
And Jim, one of the things I think we've all seen, which is why many of us have really been drawn to this concept and really making it a discipline, is that traditionally we have lacked, and I say we, those in the social sector and social change area have lacked the discipline and the infrastructure to actually systematically identify breakthroughs, vet them, and support a process of continuous improvement. Not just go down a track and keep going there blindly hoping it's going to work, but actually looking at what the data tells us about success or not, and then building upon it or jettisoning it. Looking ahead at the future, do you think collective impact actually has a chance to change the trajectory of the way people respond to these problems?
I do believe it does. I think that having been in this work inside the administration for the last almost 6 years, having been involved in philanthropy for years before that, I think that people have consistently been trying to get more disciplined and more strategic about the deployment of their resources and what organizations and strategies they support with those resources. And then at the community level, people are tired of people coming in doing lots of things without it seeming to change the outcomes on the ground for them and their families. And so I think the pressure from both of those things, combined with some new ways that people are actually starting to go beyond just getting together and collaborating to actually focusing on specific outcomes, using evidence-based work, and then seeing that actually has a different impact than the kinds of collaborations that have happened previously, I think is going to change things permanently.
And I know you use the phrase, or at least we have adopted a phrase that you use, called proof points. That we're at a point where it's really critical that places like Todd and Dan, who are doing this around the country, actually prove that we can get substantially better results. How important do you think that is, that we have successes, places that are truly trending up in solving these problems?
Well, I think at face value is critically important to getting other people to want to try it, but I also think it's important that we hold ourselves to the discipline of, if it doesn't demonstrate that it actually produces those kind of outcomes, then we need to not be trying to scale it as well.
Yep.
If this does not, the most important part about this work is the rigor by which we hold ourselves accountable for producing real outcomes. And if we don't do it, shame on us if we keep trying to push other people into the same space.
Absolutely, and that is one of the key points that Jeff and I make in the article, is that the critical nature of bringing rigor to this work, so it's not just hype and a new way of saying people work together, but it's working together for dramatically better results. And so, Jim, thank you. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes for some additional insights, but I want to transition to Jeff Edmondson if I can. Jeff, we've been talking a lot about the need for rigor and bringing it to collective impact. In a couple of minutes, we're going to hear from Dan Ryan and Todd Williams about the work happening on the ground in Dallas and in Portland, respectively. But first, can you give us a quick overview of the StriveTogether collective impact approach?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Ben, and thanks again, Jim, for joining us today. It means so much to have the administration getting behind this work. that isn't necessarily just focused on programmatic delivery, but really taking a good hard look at systems and thinking about how everybody can work together to achieve a better result. Our assumption is that everybody's had a chance to read the article, and we've heard from folks that they're most interested in the actual tools and lessons that you'll hear from Todd and Dan shortly. But just a few quick insights. One is that in order for collective impact not to be a buzzword, we really believe that first and foremost it always has to connect to moving a concrete outcome. That the work can't just be about people coming together to agree on a high-level vision. It's got to be about agreeing on what are those outcomes we want to move. And so when we say about what is the way that the StriveTogether network has worked to begin to bring rigor to the field, it's not some people sitting in an office sort of conceptually visualizing what this might take. It's a network of over 50 communities nationally that day in and day out are working to achieve this vision around 6 core outcomes. And in our case, they're education, but as Ben said, these lessons apply in any field. But those outcomes are listed on the slide here, kindergarten readiness all the way through some form of post-secondary degree completion. And in order for us to know if collective impact really is working over time, it has to demonstrate that it's moving an outcome like these at scale, whether it be in education, health, or any other sector. The next thing that we'd say is that in order for collective impact to really be different, it has to think about the system different. And in our case with education, it's about saying that we can't put institutions at the center or systems at the center. They're all critical, but we have to begin to put the child. We have to begin to put those we're trying to serve at the center and use the data that we have at our disposal in order to get better results, because we're aligning what's needed with what actually has impact. And so in order to get to that point where we are moving outcomes at scale and when we are putting the child at the center, this new paradigm, what we've come up with as a network of over 50 communities is a methodology. And there's a couple points to raise here, and you can see this methodology in the article, or go to www.strivetogether.org for a more complete version. But essentially what this says is that there's 4 key areas, 4 pillars on the left that every community needs to pay attention to, and that there are some developmental milestones. This isn't just about, as one community leader said, bringing people together and singing Kumbaya. There is a rigorous methodology here. It starts in the exploring gateway early on, where we're primarily trying to bring partners together around a shared vision and set of outcomes. We're then having the courage to release those outcomes, disaggregate the outcomes, and begin to really dig in to what the disparities are so that we can address those. It moves into sustaining when we're actually using data on the ground to identify, as Ben and Jim were saying, what really works for kids, and to begin to align the time, talent, and treasure of a community behind what works. And last is systems change, where all the partners, investors, business leaders, nonprofits, philanthropies, all the educators actually are doing things differently each and every day in order to become a proof point, which is moving outcomes at scale. What's critical here is that we can't assume that this is going to happen magically. There does have to be a true discipline to the process. And what we're hearing from communities that are engaging in this work is that the theory of action is giving them a way to frame for all their partners what kind of infrastructure, what kind of background work has to get done in order for us to truly lift up and build on what works for kids. What's interesting, though, is that in the end, the most critical piece of making this successful over the long term is going to be 4 key principles. The first is making sure that every community is able, as I said before, to have the courage to disaggregate data and begin to focus on what really works for kids, no matter what background they may come from, so that we can eliminate disparities over time. Next is to build that culture of continuous improvement, where data is used not just as a hammer to beat people up, but as a flashlight to get better results over time. Next is to leverage existing resources so that we don't fall into the trap of programitis, where we start new programs assuming that it's going to be a silver bullet to make everything work. And last is engaging a broader community voice, all those in the community, to align whatever they have to bring to the table around what they see as important and what they see working in order to get better results for their kids. So with that, I'm going to transition over to Dan Ryan from Portland, Oregon. Dan is the CEO of the Cradle to Career Partnership in Portland that's called All Hands Raised. Dan, if you could just give us a quick insight on sort of why has the theory of action been important to you, but most importantly, could you talk to us a little bit about how you've worked to eliminate disparities and build a culture of continuous improvement in your community?
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's an honor to be on this call, and I speak for many in this community. As the backbone, of course, we just corral many, many organizations and people to come to the table to work differently together. And this cross-sector work is really radical common sense. But, you know, it did lack a blueprint. And so when we got quickly into implementation, we were just so grateful that StriveTogether was listening to our shared experiences around the country, and that this theory of action was actually put into place. And we are using it definitely as a compass. And for those of you that are newer into this work, just be grateful that there's something there, but also rest assured that why it's great to be a part of this network is that we're always trying to improve, and it evolves, and that's what's great about this national work. Eliminating disparities. Well, basically, I woke up this morning to an article on the radio, and it was about bad numbers. And really, when you looked at how we were looking at the data on our kids when it was all commingled together, it was bad data because we were clumping together all of our communities. And when we know in Portland, Oregon, that we've been failing our kids of color, specifically Black, Latino, Native American, and Pacific Islander, for years, it was really relevant for us to disaggregate that data. The good news is, when we came on board a few years ago, that the Coalition of Communities of Color, our main partner in this collaborative work on eliminating disparities, had already brought that case to the market. And so in Portland and Multnomah County, there was an acceptance that it was the right thing to do. It was more important for us to always have all of the data disaggregated, so that wasn't really the big issue. The issue now was how to get into solution. And so the case was made, and so our first collaborative was built on equity. And our first failing forward story was actually that we had the room wasn't coming together just right. And a lot of this work is setting the table accurately. And so we needed policymakers. So all of the superintendents had to be at that meeting. We have 6 partner districts that we work with. We also needed the heads of the culturally specific organizations to be at the table. And it's this level of commitment and consistency that has built a trust in the room so that policies actually now are starting to emerge. So some of the concrete examples of success over the last 2 years are that we have basically almost all of the members have done racial equity assessments, and then we also now have racial equity policies in our school district with our school district partners. Another failing forward story around this, though, is that one of the superintendents commented that they failed in passing their policy at first because it was kind of from her and from a couple board members, when in fact they leaned into the room of partners that have come together in this collaborative, people from culturally specific organizations that started coming to their board meetings to testify. It became a community engagement exercise, and so then the policy did come around, and it turned around and it did pass. Another great concrete example when you put the flashlight on something that matters is the graduation gap for students of color has closed from 14.3% to 9.5% over the last 2 years. And in several of our large high schools, the gap is actually gone. So these are some early victories that we're proud of. Continuous improvement is the other component that I wanted to speak to. And collective impact was really just another word for collaboration unless you fully commit to continuous improvement. It's something that we do at all of our meetings. We have this saying around the office, it's plan, do, check, act. In every meeting we go into, we have to figure out where we are in that cycle, and it is perpetual. It just keeps revolving around. And one example of this was with our 9th grade counts collaborative, and that's the transition between 8th and 9th grade. We take the data from 8th grade metrics, and we look at those kids that are most likely not going to graduate on time, and our goal is to get the majority of those academic priority students in this summer intensive prior to 9th grade. Our goal is to have about 75% of the room being academic priority students, and in our first year of looking at the data, it was around 50%. And so first, the partners kind of rejected the data. That can't be right. And I found that you have to accept, there's an acceptance part of the process of looking at data and allowing the partners to express why maybe that doesn't seem right. And then I guess like all good improvement work, acceptance is one of the first stages to change. And so after that, we came up with strategies that were new and different and not just relying on intentions from the past. And we went, in 2 years, we went from 55% of the room, of the students involved, over 1,000 students involved in this program, to 79% being academic priority students. So those were double-digit gains in less than 2 years, in 2 years. Another one, which we really, when we were going into implementation in a couple of our other collaboratives, the rooms were simply too big to move the data, to move into action, actually. And so we were spending too much time with a room that was full of community of interest people as opposed to community of action folks. So we literally had to scale down and get those that were more directly involved in the work, and then we broke it down into 6 demonstration site schools. So with that, we now have some targets that have just been reached. For example, one that I'll just highlight here at the end is that we targeted early registration for kindergarten because we were noticing that a large percentage of our students of color and our immigrant students weren't registering for kindergarten on time. They were starting late. So that picked up from 67% to 84% in just 1 year when we focused on that action. So those are a couple examples.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dan. Those are great examples for sure, and appreciated your story of failing forward. I think that's been an ethic that the network as a whole has adopted, which is really being transparent and hopefully in communities as part of this work, especially when it comes to building this culture of continuous improvement, partners can embrace that as well. Todd, so let's shift over to you. If you could just give us a quick take on the power of having something like the theory of action to guide your work, but more importantly, some examples of the third and the fourth principles of leveraging existing assets and engaging community expertise and voice.
Sure, Jeff. I think one of the things probably worth noting is that the Commit partnership is relatively new. We've only been around for roughly 2 years, so we're early in our life cycle. But I think that one of the things that our partnership of roughly 130 institutions has found is that one of the most important existing assets that can be leveraged for the theory of action is data. In Texas, existing data is abundant, but frankly, we are a data-rich and incredibly information-poor state. To leverage existing assets, whether they be philanthropic funding or volunteer resources or corporate expertise, you first have to create a case for urgent change in your community by giving the big picture data about what your total educational pipeline is producing. And we've also found that it's been important to make sure that the pipeline that we analyze is regionally large enough so that no one who controls resources can delude themselves that problems in your educational outcomes are really limited to 1 or 2 underperforming districts. So our scope is Dallas County, which is roughly 15 school districts and roughly 500,000 students in K through 12. And that we found that the mega big picture data is also important in driving resources and policymakers to address the right leaks in the pipeline. As you can see by the slide that we have here in front of you, we've really been relentlessly driving home the impact that can be seen in our early kindergarten readiness, which is only 49%, and our literacy ceiling, which in 3rd grade is roughly 35%, and we think that those are creating meaningful ceilings for subsequent academic achievement. And as a result, that's really where we're driving most of our early work today is in that part of the continuum. If you go to the next slide, one of the ways that can be seen more clearly about using existing data and disaggregating it and segmenting existing data by high income, medium income, and low income districts. So that's what you see here on the slide here, high income on the left, low income districts on the right. And this has been a really powerful chart in our own community by highlighting where the achievement gap really starts and that our high income districts have twice the level of kindergarten readiness as our low income districts, and that districts, regardless of income, do not seem to be able to get their 3rd grade reading or their 4th grade math achievement above where their students come in kindergarten ready. And as a result, our region has really become mobilized to focus on this area with our largest school district, which is Dallas ISD, roughly 160,000 students, recently announcing an intense focus supported by many members of the community to serve every 3- and 4-year-old in the district by 2020, while concurrently focusing on quality by reducing their student-teacher ratios to 8 to 1. If you go to the next slide, Jeff, existing data has also been helpful in helping find where those critical community voices are that we can leverage out there. This slide highlights, and this is basically our third grade reading with each of these dots representing a campus. And so as you see, as you move along from left to right towards schools with more and higher poverty, you see increasingly incredible dispersion of academic achievement, 60 to 70-point gaps. And so we're really focusing on grabbing the voices that are in the green circle and really gathering their voice to learn and explain their outlier achievement, and then taking those voices to the campuses in the orange to see if those best practices perceived to in fact exist, and if they don't, then really working hard with multiple stakeholders to replicate them in the community. And if you, as an example, if you go to the next slide, we've been working actively in 14 elementary schools, which are serving 8,000 low-income children that have been struggling substantially with literacy. And we've used that community voice of expertise to drive new and existing assets to those schools. For example, we've used existing assets like Teach for America and local universities to provide professional literacy development to non-TFA teachers. We've been training teachers on how to use literacy data and literacy curriculum that they had available within their existing schools. We've asked existing foundations to fund Donors Choose programs to support existing assets that we need in there. And we've been asking a lot of existing local private schools to provide literacy tutoring by their juniors and seniors in high school to nearby public schools where kids are behind. And we've seen 15 and 20-point gains at a number of schools on literacy where the collective model has been implemented with fidelity. And then next slide, we've leveraged community voices to talk about best practices through our annual achievement scorecard, through our online stories of impact that highlight existing community assets that are doing great work that can be copied and scaled elsewhere throughout our region. And we also believe, frankly, that our community voice can be understood through analyzing philanthropic behavior. Where are those who've been charged with investing dollars in education after much research and analysis, putting their own dollars across our region? How much are they deploying toward early childhood versus teacher prep versus college access, and why? And then finally, on the last slide, we've really analyzed the voice of legislators who, again, after much research and lobbying of others, have established policies for school accountability, which can be big drivers of adult behavior. And we would argue that based on data, sometimes those policies can create adult incentives that may or may not serve students in the method intended. For example, this chart really tries to show that in elementary schools in Texas, where 1 in 10 children in the country are educated, that school accountability in elementary school incentivizes campus principals to put their best educators and their most resources in the later grades of 4th and 5th grade, because that's where all the testing is occurring. And a lot of community voices are working with us to shape policy to say that as a result, our most vulnerable students aren't really getting the solid foundation that they need by 3rd grade, as pre-K access has been limited and pre-K through 2nd education has been inconsistent in quality. And so we're working with legislators on trying to address that point as well.
Thanks so much, Todd. There was a lot in there, and we have a lot of questions coming in, and so we're going to get to those in just a couple minutes. But the whole idea of really using the data, not just to let it alone dictate what works, but to really identify the community voices you need to help interpret that data, and then identify the strategies and existing resources you can leverage, is so powerful, and your leadership has been just so critical in making that happen. So very quickly, and then Jim, we're going to come back to you, because one of our questions is around what is the role of the federal government in advocating for this work, and potentially local government as well. But here is a slide from the original Strive partnership in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky, where we are actually seeing consistent improvements in the key metrics. Once again, not by starting new programs per se, but really using data in individual partners and their programs and services, and then collectively to identify and build on what works. And the good news is that in additional partnerships now nationally, like All Hands Raised in Portland, Commit in Dallas, and the Roadmap Project in Seattle led by Mary Jean Ryan, we're seeing very positive indicators of success as well. It's just so encouraging because these communities have committed to a common methodology. They're committing to figuring out what over time could be those standards of practice for collective impact that will really help us make a difference at scale. So Jim, just back to you real quick before we take some of these questions, is what do you think is most critical for these communities and others within our network and across the country to accomplish in the next year or two to really inform policy decisions at the federal level in order to make sure that this impact is sustained. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think there are 3 or 4 things that are really important to do. One is, people who are trying to do the work on the ground understand more than anyone else what the real impediments are, whether it's around data and data access and managing the privacy issues and the regulations around those, or whether it's the challenges with integrating funding streams from different sources. Whatever those things are, we need to get really precise about what the barriers are and what we could do at the federal level to overcome them. And so getting that feedback from the communities that are doing this work back to the federal government is pretty critical. The second thing is that there's a number of different initiatives that are being led from the administration that attempt to support the creation of this kind of collective impact infrastructure. And so making sure that the way that we're doing that work, whether it's through the Promised Neighborhoods program or encouraging this kind of infrastructure to be deployed by the mayors that adopt the MBK Challenge, those kinds of the importance of the feedback about whether or not we're actually doing that in a way that facilitates true collective impact, meaning not just people coming together and having meetings, but also driving towards impact and using practices that work. That's the second thing, is that we need to make sure that as we push hard to get things done, we're allowing the time and the resources to be leveraged to move the field. And I'll stop there. The other things that are important are we have lots of programs that can fit into different elements of this work. And so how we tweak those programs so that whether it's the work on the school improvement grants to turn around the worst performing schools, or whether it's the early learning grants that are going into some communities to create these 0 to 5 pathways, how we need to make sure that we're structuring those programs so that they support the collective impact approach to the work and build on the infrastructure that these communities are building.
Outstanding. It has been so critical to have your voice consistently advocating on behalf of providing that greater flexibility so that over time we can have more resources flowing to what local communities are able to identify and lift up what really works for kids. So let's go to some question and answer now, and Jim will be including you in this as well. But let's start with Dan. Dan, there were 2 questions here. One was around how have you seen the use of disaggregated data lead to improvements in eliminating those disparities? And then second, can you talk a little bit more concretely about the PlanDoCheckAct concept, where you're actually using data on an ongoing basis, not just once as a hammer, but on an ongoing basis to illuminate what works? Could you take that?
Sure. Well, the disaggregated data was something that we just got on the shoulders of the Coalition of Communities of Color here in our market, which is an organization that has done an outstanding job of bringing the case to everyone that it's imperative that we always disaggregate the data. The reason why it's important in terms of getting measurements and results is because it's our opportunity. Our biggest chance for student success and economic prosperity in Multnomah County is to improve that data. When we look at our rising population, the fastest growing market, which is the Latino population here in Multnomah County, and to think that we're failing our students at such a high level, those are our future employers and those are our future consumers. And so the business community really got behind that need as well. And so really it's just each of our collaboratives, all 5 of them, we disaggregate the data and we have an equity focus on all of our strategies. So it's not just an Eliminating Disparities collaborative. In terms of PlanDoCheckAct, well, it's really just a discipline. It's basically kind of like how we get ready for work every day. And so for an example that I think could make sense, because I spoke a little bit to 9th grade counts, and we talked about the fact that we weren't reaching our marks in terms of getting our academic priority students engaged in the program, which predominantly are kids of color and kids that don't have as much resources at home. And so it was not shocking that we weren't reaching them, or they wouldn't have been having challenges up until 8th grade anyway. But what we had to do is basically our action was that we were going to increase those numbers, and then when we put out a new strategy to increase that, then we had to do the program, and then we had to get the data back at the end of the summer and see how we did. And then you have to then spend the off season, if you will, reloading with improved strategies that will keep improving the results. There's no such thing as ever thinking that we hit nirvana. It's just always about improving in everything that we do. And so you just take that plan, do it, and then you check the results, and then you reload again. That's just how we do all of our work and all of our collaboratives. And we usually start the meetings off with a data point that gets the whole room engaged so that they all feel that they're engaged in what the problem is. And we never use data to shame. It's just data is to illuminate, is to show what our possibilities and our promises are and where our opportunities are. So.
That's great. I think this idea of socializing the use of data so that people get used to it not being used as a shaming mechanism is huge. We've heard from numerous communities that comes up.
And particularly in communities of color, I think the No Child Left Behind years, we have a lot of healing that's had to go on around that. And this gives us an opportunity to look at data in a more inspiring way because, in fact, we just want to improve the data for their communities. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Todd, there's one question here that acknowledges that some of these initial outcomes that you spoke to are phenomenal in the way that you sort of frame the data, disaggregating it by income levels and challenging the community to figure out how to get those early grade reading scores up to the kindergarten readiness levels is really compelling. Can you give a concrete example of how you actually identified a practice that works? For example, maybe digging into one of those schools in your hope chart, sort of something that you saw actually worked and how then that was scaled.
Sure. So, for example, when we went to these outlier schools in high poverty that were getting strong literacy achievement, we found that one of the common best practices that many cited was the use of a centralized leveled library where books were sorted and aggregated based on their difficulty so that a child didn't pick up a book and found it too difficult for them and then put it back down. And basically it was very common in almost every school we looked at that was a common practice. Yet when we went to the schools that were literacy challenged, we found that almost none of them had a leveled library. And so we basically brought the data to the school district, and they ultimately purchased 13 leveled libraries for 13 elementary schools. I mean, that's just one example. One quick example might be we also looked at how much books were being checked at each of the libraries.
Great. That concrete example is outstanding, and if Dan, if you have those in a minute, that'd be great. But Jim, there's one concrete question for you around the best ways to provide feedback to the federal government based on what people are identifying actually does work on the ground. What have you found to be the best ways to actually hear about those practices that really get results?
So I think there's a couple of ways to go. One is that there is a Promised Neighborhoods Program Office that has promised, I believe, I need to double-check the email address, but I believe it's still promisedneighborhoods@ed.gov is the email address to send stuff into. The second is that we have a funded set of intermediate technical assistance providers, the CSSP or the Promised Neighborhoods Institute, that are out in the field on a regular basis supporting organizations trying to do collective impact work at a variety of levels. And Promised Neighborhoods Institute in particular is a mechanism to provide that feedback and have it brought back to the department. But if you want to come direct, you can always just email me at jim.shelton@ed.gov and or use that other email address for the program office that I gave you.
Wow, I don't think I've ever been on a call where an official at your level has given out their emails. So that is incredibly appreciated, and the access is wonderful. For Dan and Todd and Jim, you may have thoughts on this as well, given all of your background working in the social sector. One question came in about forced collaboration. How do you avoid community agencies really struggling with the sense that they're forced into working with others rather than feeling as if there's a clear benefit to them, an enlightened self-interest, if you will, to taking this on? And related to that, Dan, you mentioned the ideas of communities of interest versus communities of action. One group that often feels like they are forced to collaborate is groups that may not be necessarily delivering services, but want to have a voice. So maybe in your response, if you could touch on ways for that community to effectively engage. So Dan, maybe you could take that first, and then Todd.
Okay, take the last one you just mentioned. So the comment on shifting from communities of interest to communities of action, and I think it's about different parts of the continuum. So when you're in the planning stage, I think that it's fine to have stakeholders from around the market. And then there's that transition where you need the practitioners that are closer to the ground when you're implementing the work. And so I think that they can both be involved in the process. It's just when you make that pivot. And in Portland, which tends to be overly polite, it's how do you dismiss them from a meeting was where we needed some help from your trainers at StriveTogether, so that we had the courage to basically exit them out of the room because it wasn't necessary. We needed to focus. Yeah.
On our side, on the forced collaboration, I would say that we definitely existing coalition, and when we looked at data where there were underperforming
Todd,
schools.
we might need you. Todd, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we might need you to move a little bit further away from the microphone. It's coming in as a little fuzzy. Thanks.
Is this better?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I think that basically went to multiple schools and asked them to effectively interview and effectively, in some ways, compete for us to come and turn them into a collective action network within that region, because we knew that leadership needed to be really engaged and wanting this to happen versus it being forced upon them. And once we turned it into that process, we definitely got people who wanted to work with us on a daily basis and welcome the effort versus those who felt like it might be forced upon them.
Great. Thanks a lot. So, Jim, have you seen this nationally? Have you heard folks push back on, kind of being compelled beyond their will to get involved in this type of work? And if so, have you seen folks deal with that in different and creative ways?
So I think there are a couple of things I'd love to touch base on. One is I just want to commend the conversation we just had about the discipline and, frankly, the commitment it takes to have these uncomfortable conversations with people in order to be more effective and have the kind of impact that our children deserve. And that is one thing to disinvite people from the conversation when they are not necessary for progress, and it's another thing to disinvite them when they are not performing up to the level of expectations that they set and that the group has for the members that are participating. But that kind of commitment is critically important, recognizing that this is a framework that's about inclusiveness at its heart. The second thing is that, in particular, when funding becomes a part of the conversation and access to funding, these conversations become particularly tense. And that is when people start to feel coerced and or particularly sensitive about being excluded. And there is definitely a concern that has been raised, and that is why the points that were made later on about the importance of early community voice and buy-in, so that the community-based organizations in particular that are effective, that have been doing this work for years, are a part of the conversation and have access to resources, are a part of the collective impact framework. I cannot overemphasize how important that is to the success of being able to maintain the kind of structure and infrastructure and discipline, continuous improvement process that we're talking about. Those things go hand in hand.
Now, Jeff, can I comment on that for just a second? I think it's so important in how you build your infrastructure, your governance infrastructure. So our board is made up of 50% of members of communities of color that are also from the corporate sector, and our leadership team is similar. And so you just have to make sure that the way that you build your network is really strategic, so that there's kind of a witness protection plan that we're building a community of willing that wants to move this data forward. And there's not a promise that you're coming together because you received some new grant. You're coming together because we've been failing and we want to figure out how to actually do authentic change. And then the hope is that the money will follow these changed behaviors as opposed to these wild intentions. And most of the past work that I've seen in my 3 decades of trying to be effective as an adult is that we get too much funding for some wild new aspiration and intention as opposed to organic grassroots change on the ground, and then we want government investments and philanthropic investments to line up with those new practices that are getting us the success that we deserve for our kids that we failed.
Outstanding. Thanks a lot, Dan. I think one of the tools that I believe in Portland was used was the Courageous Conversations framework to begin to have some of these very difficult conversations that Jim referenced, to say that we really have to have that discipline to focus on what the data says is needed, what community members say is needed, and not do what you were talking about, Dan, and spray and pray as we've talked about it over the years. Another uncomfortable conversation that was brought up in one of the questions, and we're going to try to get to as many of these as we can, thank you, there's so many great ones in here, is around the staffing needed to do this. And we've started to talk less about a single backbone organization, but more as a broader backbone function, where there are core staff that do need to sit in one place, as they do at Commit and All Hands Raised. But there's also other roles that partners can play. But the reality is if you're investing in those roles, sometimes there can be a lot of fear that that'll take money away from other areas of work. So, Todd, can you just talk a little bit about how you've staffed this and then how you've built the case for doing this so that it could actually generate more resources down the line?
Well, I think building the case for doing it was really talking about the sense of urgency through the data, and then frankly leveraging off and having Jeff come down to our region and talk about the success in Cincinnati, because we had a number of efforts in Dallas that had kind of mixed success from an educational standpoint. In terms of how we've staffed our backbone organization, we have a number of former educators who work with us on a daily basis. I think they need to have strong emotional EQ, the ability to work with people in the community, have credibility in the classroom. We've also wanted to have a diverse staff, and we've also wanted to make sure that we had, as part of our team, some people who had management consulting expertise, because those are people that are trained in taking a lot of data, synthesizing it to some clear messages, and influencing their clients versus directing their clients. So I think those are all key strategies that we've deployed here locally.
Hey, Jeff, could I add something to that?
Absolutely.
This is Ben, because I think one of the key things is that there's a different conversation that people have to have with their local funders. And one of them is that they actually have to urge their local funders to join them as a leader in this effort and an important local partner, not just a funder, and that they have to help them to understand that process is the new program, that you actually have to pay for this process. And it's not good enough to just put money into a new program. You actually need to fund a new way of working, and that, in fact, you should urge them to fund results, not outputs, but outcomes.
That's outstanding. I remember one of the quotes from a community that we worked with that when they were talking to their local investors, they said, action looks different now. Mm-hmm. Action is not necessarily a new program. It could be us actually investing in the existing programs and making sure that they're implementing those practices to get results, and that's okay. So we just talked a little bit about the philanthropic sector. There's another question here about the business sector, about the private sector. And I'm curious as to what creative ways, Dan, that you may have been able to engage the private sector, Todd, you as well, as a part of this work beyond just the funds that they may invest behind outcomes.
Well, for us, the business sector is highly involved in the way that we've built our infrastructure. One is leaders in the business sector have been forced to think about how to be cutting edge in terms of systems improvement, because they have the pressure of the quarterly report, the stockholders making sure that they're basically making profits, or that they think. So they have the PlanDoCheckAct cycle that is just a part of their culture. So as we've been building the continuous improvement discipline within our culture that we're trying to take around to the school districts or the nonprofit partners, the government space, if it wasn't for their wisdom and also their empathy with how difficult this is to implement, we really wouldn't be able to stay strong and continue to be focused on this. So we get some of our best feedback from our corporate leaders, and they also, I think, have developed so much more compassion for how difficult it is to move the needle, because they know the challenges of doing that within their own organization, within their own payroll that they control. So then they're seeing us try to do this cross-sector, cross-payroll, cross whatever you want to say, however you want to put the puzzle together, and they're just really rooting for us to be focused so that this is really a new way of doing work in our community. And they love that it's all about alignment. And so do the funders, and so do, I think, many of the partners, but they're coming together because of their willingness to improve. But let me tell you, it's hard for them to make that shift, that they have to do the shared responsibility and the shared credit. And so the Backbone's role is to really be a covenant of that shared responsibility, shared accountability, and shared credit. And so it's a very humble role, the Backbone, but if you don't have an independent agent that's guiding this, then I believe that it can get lost and it can suddenly be hijacked into some old behavior, and the status quo won't be challenged.
So, Todd, what about you? Effective ways to engage the business community?
I think we're still learning this. That's what I would say where we've probably had the most success has really been in the use of data and systems and creating the ability and adding to our own internal capacity to crunch and analyze data and visualize data in an efficient way. And I think the second thing is there's a number of corporations that want to engage their employees from a volunteer standpoint, whether it be tutoring, et cetera, don't know really how to engage it. And so we've said, listen, come where we are, because not only will we help you get access into the school in a more efficient way than perhaps you've seen in the past, but we'll also be able to tell you what impact you're playing to, as we've got data sharing agreements with each of these schools and the districts themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's a tremendous point. I know in Cincinnati, when I had the privilege of being the initial director of this work, it was GE Aviation that brought to bear a lot of their talent around doing continuous improvement. And then now it's Children's Hospital, because we're finding that nationally in sites all across the country, the health sector is 10 to 15 years ahead of the education sector on how to use data. And so leveraging that talent within a given community can be incredibly powerful. And then we're working now with Living Cities with a subset of the Cradle to Career Network on connecting workforce, the career end of the Cradle to Career continuum to this, so that there's a real clear connection. And I think there has been a great deal of focus on early childhood, but this is sort of a next frontier. Another question that came in, and Jim, you may have thoughts on this that I'll hit on in a second. But Dan, how have you engaged existing initiatives? So it could be a federal initiative, it could be a local initiative, to be part of this work so that it is not overshadowed but only credit given. How have you effectively engaged existing work, like a college access initiative, for example, or something of that sort, to be
I'm actually going to go to the other part of that continuum to answer this question. That would be early learning. The state has done huge investments of late for early learning initiatives throughout the state of Oregon, and there was this big investment coming to Multnomah County, and it was very important for the leaders that are involved in the All Hands Raised Partnership that this plugged into this system so that we didn't have another big initiative going on that took away resources and intellectual capital and also grit on the ground. And so it was very important for us to knit that into our Cradle to Career system. And so we took what was a smaller collaborative that was just focused on ready for kindergarten, and now we bring in the public health space as we look at the 0 to 4 years, and now we have a big early learning initiative that is receiving funds from the state, and our partner in this is United Way of Columbia-Willamette. And so that's a good example of trying to make sure that we keep efficient as we build this system from birth to career, and that was very important to our stakeholders, especially in the business community and also in the foundation community.
Great. Todd, have you had any success with that?
Not to that level. Not to that level yet.
Great. So, Jim, have you heard of efforts nationally in this and other efforts to engage federal programs into this work?
Yeah, I mean, so where we're seeing some of the most exciting work is where, and we try and encourage this through the way we're designing our applications now for our different programs, is to get people to really focus on the opportunity to blend funding streams, to leverage existing programs that are already underway, and in demonstrating that you've been thoughtful about how to do so and inclusive in do it, that has actually created an opportunity for greater impact as you pull all the rest of the pieces together. So that not only does that create the opportunity for building on the assets that are already there, but one of the big questions that always comes up is how do you sustain this work? And the smarter we get about how to blend these funding streams and make those connections natural and stick for a long time, the more sustainable this work will be.
Great. So we've actually got a question from Twitter that helps us to begin to get to conclude this work, and so you can do that by going to #CollectiveImpact. And this would be for Dan and Todd, sort of a final comment here. What would you say is the single greatest barrier that you overcame to move from talk to action, so that we're not stuck in people just coming together and talking to each other, but actually moving outcomes on the ground? So Todd, what would you say the biggest barrier is that you overcame to get to that point? All right, let's go to you, Dan.
This is a tough one. You know, breaking down egos and silos is a big deal. And we're used to staying focused on the problem, and then everyone wants to show up at the meeting and make sure they're the smartest person at that meeting to explain that they know the problem better than anyone else. And so really it was the continuous improvement discipline that focused us to get a charter built, to say this is our scope, and eventually the communities of interest, sometimes the community of noise, just went away because it became clear that this was a solution-based initiative and that our engagement, which is heavy and deep and has actually brought in partners that have never been at the table before, because there's all these wonderful grassroots organizations around the market that just weren't politically positioned to be a part of these conversations in the past because they're too busy on the ground doing the work. They're gradually coming into the network, and some of the buzzers, if you will, are onto something else. And so we just stay very focused on the action plans, the action plans, the action plans, the data, the data, the data, and perhaps we just bore these folks and they stop coming. I don't know, but I do appreciate the discipline that the framework of continuous improvement brings to this work, and then it seems to eliminate the talk and then you just go right into action.
Jeff?
Yeah.
I think data, can't emphasize data enough in terms of its ability to motivate people, and I think also once we started the action networks, the voice from the community, from the schools, who could come to these meetings of various councils and talk about how the work was making a difference in their day-to-day work, and the level of trust that had been developed was key.
Yeah, lifting up those bright spots and using that data as a flashlight and really committing to that, it feels like it's huge. So, Jim, just to finish off with you, and then I'll have a couple things before handing it back to Paul, but I mean, you inspired us with the quote in the article that said, "We've just simply got to get proof points." What concluding thoughts do you have about what we need to do to make sure this work of collective impact actually does become rigorous and lead to the impact we all desire?
So the good news is I think that you are doing a lot of the things that are necessary. If you look at, I'll just use the My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge that's out there, where there are close to 150 communities that have now committed to taking a hard look at their data, identifying specific goals they want to pursue that are aligned with the areas that were identified in the report, doing the policy review, and looking at what programs they plan to scale to move those numbers. All of those communities are going to be, whether they realize it or not at this time, figuring out how to pull together a collective impact approach to this work if they do it right. And what is necessary, though, is for them to have access to tools, resources, and people with experience that can help them not make the same mistakes that many of your communities that have been doing this work have struggled with over time, and to tell them to have faith and courage as they have to get shouted at as they go through the process of becoming more disciplined about outcomes and putting kid outcomes first, even more than loud adult interests.
Outstanding. So we'd encourage folks to go to strivetogether.org/blog to continue this conversation. And Paul, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for joining us today for the Communities Defining Quality Collective Impact. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and a special thank you to the panelists, Jeff Edmondson, Ben Hecht, Dan Ryan, Jim Shelton, and Todd Williams. It was really a fabulous experience. And to continue the conversation on collective impact, in addition to going to Strive, we invite you to join us for 2 additional webinars in the coming months with other veterans from the field. On November 5th, we'll be doing an event called Too Much Collective, Too Little Impact, aligning multiple initiatives in one community. And on January 20th, we're doing one called It's About the Community, Why Community Engagement and Process Matter in Collective Impact. You can register for these events through the Collective Impact Forum's website. As a reminder, we ask you to take a moment and complete the evaluation that will appear momentarily on your screen. It's really important, especially as we prepare to these next 2 events, to get your feedback on this one so we can make it as interactive and helpful as possible. And you'll find today's PowerPoint slides as well as links to the Quality Collective Impact article on the collectiveimpactforum.org website. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. And as a personal note, as I'm new to the Collective Impact Forum, I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you very much, and have a great day.